And Jonathan is also working for JVTA, and we have a long time cooperation, friendship, Nippon Connection and JVTA, and we are very happy that you will present some events here at our online film festival. And yeah, Ishii-san, maybe you can tell something about the events you will present.
Thank you for your introduction. And first of all, congratulations on your 20th anniversary this year. And we are very honored to be part of this year's online festival. I feel very special. And I'm here to proudly present Jonathan Hall's special lecture about the very interesting topic about relationship between the letters, the words, text, and the screen and the film. And I'd like to make an announcement, small announcement about other events we are presenting at this year's Nippon Connection, which will be happens to be tomorrow. We are presenting two different events tomorrow from noon, like 12 p.m. In German time. We are presenting an interesting Japanese demo experience. This is for the complete Japanese beginner or anybody who are interested in learning Japanese or knowing more about the Japanese cultures. So it's going to be a little short presentation and the workshop starting from 12 p.m. And from 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Mr. Hall and myself are presenting a subtitling workshop. We are going to subtitle a little piece from anime, the very popular anime. It's called Shirobako, and also another very popular Japanese reality show called Terrace House. So anybody interested, please make sure to join us. So see you tomorrow. And enjoy Mr. Hall's lecture today. Thank you.
Yeah, Jonathan, I would like to thank you for joining us. And after the lecture, the audience, online audience, can ask questions, or during your lecture, you can write in the chat on the Vimeo. We have a Vimeo live stream, and on the right side there's a chat, and there you can just write any questions you have during the lecture, and afterwards we will send the questions to Jonathan, and he will answer it. And the lecture will be about 1 hour. And yeah, and now please start and have a good lecture and good luck.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Internet connection will be good.
Yes, we pray for that. Thank you very much, Marianne. It's a delight to see you. Whenever I go to Germany, to Frankfurt, I see you and I'm happy. This time I'm a little sad to see you from afar, but like Ishii-san, I'd like to congratulate everyone at Nippon Connection for 20 years. It's really amazing to see how something that began so small is so powerful and so important in the world of Japanese cinema today. A real testament to the power of, you could say, grassroots cultural organizing, which is in some way part of the topic I'm addressing today. Today I'd like to also thank JVTA for sponsoring this lecture. I've worked with JVTA off and on for more than 10 years and or coming around 10 years, and it's been a wonderful experience. And I really support the kinds of cultural programming that they do, and I also would like to thank them for their continued support of so much in the world of Japanese visual culture overseas. So today, I must begin my lecture. I'm an American speaking to you from Chicago. And as you perhaps know, I'm sure you've read, in addition to the coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic that we are all suffering, the United States has a horrific history of hundreds of years of slavery and racial discrimination and apartheid-like pseudo-democracy, and that's the current state that we are hoping will be rectified. There's been protests over the death of George Floyd and Breonna Breonna Thompson, as well as others. Of course, it's impossible, I think, to begin a lecture without, in some ways, mentioning the tragedy of the loss of their lives and this moment of change that hopefully will come in the United States. To a more perhaps prosaic topic, but one that is in fact related to the question of politics of racial and colonial and also, we could say, capitalist histories. I'd like to present on the relationship between big and small. Increasingly, our screens are getting smaller and our letters are getting bigger. That's the overall thematic of the lecture. But I'd like to use it as a kind of way to work through, sometimes in a conversational way, sometimes reading, sometimes also sharing some videos, some thoughts I've had about subtitling and about text on screen, and the kind of directions that these media have been taking in the last few years. So this is not narrowly limited to Japanese material. In fact, for the large part, we won't deal directly with Japanese material at all. But of course, because so many of us do receive our Japanese media through subtitled formats or through dubbed formats, it's really important for us to think about how language works and how the text on the screen work. And I'd like to work with that, work with you on that terrain today. So I'll begin by sharing a PowerPoint that you'll be able to see, I think, on screen. Just one moment, please. All right, so the title of my talk today is Small Screen, Big Titles. I'm working as a university teacher and researcher right now at the University of California, Riverside, which is near Los Angeles. And I also work as a subtitler. If you're interested in contacting me, give me some questions. If you're a little shy and don't want to ask them during the presentation today, don't hesitate to write to me. We'll be dealing today with recent histories of the subtitle. I think we all know what subtitles are, but I think their recent shifts and changes in the media industry will be of interest to you. I'm thinking here about new technologies. And we have in this opening image of mine, still from a recently very powerful film by the Native American First Nations, as would be said in Canada, Native American director Sky Hopinka from his Dislocation Blues of 2017. This is actually an image from Standing Rock, which is where there was Native American as well as community, and then eventually nationwide opposition to the building of a pipeline that would certainly threaten the environment and threaten tribal lands, which are also religious lands, and also risk, of course, great ecological damage, but something that was violently suppressed by the United States and by local government forces. We'll get back to the politics in a moment, but it's a kind of a dark image to start with. And as you see, we'll move through this presentation. Hopefully, increasingly, the topic will become lighter and more hopeful. That's certainly my intention. So I've organized today's lecture into 4 different chapters. The chapters are of various varying lengths. They're not exactly the same length. In fact, some quite short. But we're going to be thinking through 4 different, what might seem quite unrelated questions around the image and the text upon it, namely the subtitle or the caption. So we might say that, and I'll just read here for a moment. We might say that this era is we've entered into the era of the age of the title and the end of the titler. The powerful omnipresence of the subtitle, along with the globalized ruination of subtitling, as a mass media profession. Now, don't give up hope. I'm actually very hopeful about what subtitles can do and what subtitlers can do. But we'll think about what is meant by this globalized ruination of subtitling. And of course, much of this has to do with new streaming technologies. So today I've organized a set of topics and questions that are intended to do a limited number of things in the time we have today. First of all, without presuming any familiarity or background, I'd like to introduce to you the material structures, the material means, as well as the material conditions of subtitling work today. Second, I'd like to raise questions of the use of the subtitle and the way in which the subtitle might break up and disturb a seamless connection between image and word. And third, in the hope that there are people interested in alternative uses of subtitle and alternative strategies of localization, I'd like to think about for whom does the subtitle localize? For whom does the subtitle make a quote-unquote foreign text available? In closing, we'll take a look at a Native American film director who uses the subtitle or text on screen in a very provocative and interesting way. But I'd like to begin my discussion most specifically today with reference to a short article just a few years ago from the Indian subcontinent. It was Chandu Gopalkrishnan who wrote in the New Delhi Economic Times very excitedly, "Digital cinema makes subtitling easier and cost-effective. There is growing demand among filmmakers for subtitles," said Janaki Sabesh of Real Image Media Technologies, a firm that works on television and film technology. And he continues, Mr. Sabesh, "About 90% of Hindi films are subtitled. Down south, all big budget Tamil, Telugu, and Malayalam films have subtitles. Subtitling also helps the producer take full advantage of his film star's power, whether it be Rajinikanth movies running to packed houses in Mumbai, or the Khans, Amir, Salman, and Shah Rukh, performing before their celluloid majesty to mostly Tamil-speaking audience in Chennai. Or even the case of a low-budget Malayalam film like Nikasham, Pachkadal, Chuvana Bhumi, Blue Sky, Green Sea, and Red Earth, completing a 50-day run in Bangalore last year, thanks to Northeasterners wanting to catch a glimpse of Manipuri actress Surjabala Kijam. Producers are learning that a film's market widens with some investment in subtitling. So, of course, India is a very central player in the first half of this narrative, in a way, because the role of Indian subtitlers has become increasingly significant in the world market. But let's step back from the subcontinent and think a little more broadly. So subtitling, what is it? It's long been a method for producers and distributors to offer movies or videos in different languages. And on the comparatively recent DVD format, comparatively, this is in the long sense of the history of the subtitle, a distributor could fit subtitles from numerous languages onto a single DVD. And small to large companies exist ready to provide authoring-ready subtitle streams for both standard definition DVD as well as high definition Blu-ray discs. In short, the process of subtitling involves preparing the timed, spotted script, translating it, and then encoding or rendering the subtitles to either authoring-ready files or to a master video. Of course, the terrains where we might see subtitles include high-definition distribution, broadcast on air, cable, or satellite, DVD, Blu-ray distribution, video distribution, airline distribution, theatrical distribution, of course in theaters, movie theaters, corporate, and of course the internet. And really it's the latter, the internet, that is perhaps the most significant player in today's discussion of the subtitle. In the case of the latter, it's usually called streaming, and that's what is witnessing an amazing growth these days. In 2017, Cisco Systems Visual Networking Index estimated that by next year, 2021, global IP networks will be delivering 3 trillion internet video minutes per month. And as reported in Slator, a kind of online magazine dedicated to translation and language and intelligence, as it calls itself, media localization is an area that is experiencing a so-called talent crunch. In some ways, this is a broad crunch. Voice actors, dubbers, subtitlers, and visual localizers are all needed. Now, you might wonder what a visual localizer is. Well, that refers, for example, to someone who will adjust the image, localize the image. Of course, localization does not necessarily happen simply at the level of language or words. It can occur at the level of the image. So in this sense, localization by removing, for example, inappropriate images, for example, taking beer out of a commercial to be broadcast in Saudi Arabia. Of course, the use of back catalog TV series and movie titles is fueling an seemingly insatiable market, for more visual content. This is especially true in the case in the increase of OTT, or over-the-top content delivered over the internet, including but not limited to players like Netflix, Amazon, and Hulu. Let's just take a look. We'll try and tell this story of streaming through a very local example, one that comes to us from Northern Europe. And here I kind of labeled this chapter, chapter 1, A Country Cousin Goes to Hollywood. So this is Mr. Bjorn Liffegren here in a family photo that he's posted online. Certainly a very interesting hero, you could say, or at least protagonist for our first chapter today. So Mr. Liffegren was until recently head at BTI Media Services, and he describes an extraordinary shift in his career. Of course, he began his work largely producing localization at the level of subtitling and at the level of dubbing for the Nordic markets. So media localization, he says, used to be the non-attractive part of the media industry, the cousin from the countryside, with high focus on price pressure and being more of an obstacle rather than an enabler to reach new audiences. Mr. Liffegren tells us that the entire Nordic subtitling market consists of about only 25,000 hours of subtitling, plus a few extra 100 of hours of dubbing per year for each of the Nordic languages. But something changed. And of course, this was the arrival of OTT, over-the-top transmission, can be called streaming as well. So over-the-top refers, in fact, to anything that you can access without going through cable or broadcast lines. So our most common examples would be something like Netflix, or in the American case, Hulu. But we can also include things like an Apple Player or iTunes, which is also delivered over the top, even though it requires a download. Netflix, of course, does not require the download to be complete before you start watching. So in 2015, Netflix rolled out global streaming services to consumers in 130 countries. By the next year, so by 2016, Netflix was delivering 150 million hours of streaming video per day with a global customer base of 93 million users. And in 2016, following in quick suit, Amazon made Prime Video available in 200 countries. So at the same time as we see this extraordinary rise in the popularity of the subtitled medium, we also see an increasingly dire conditions for subtitlers themselves. A gutting of subtitler rates over the last 3 decades seems to have accelerated. So in the case of Mr. Lefebvre, he describes visiting, getting a call from Hollywood, going to Hollywood and having a meeting in the new offices of Netflix, where suddenly Netflix was asking for 10,000 hours of subtitling in 3 months. So here we see the way in which, to read from the quote here, Netflix was talking about doing nearly half of what the normal volume was in only 12 weeks. Clearly a challenge. In the following 3 years, he wrote, we helped Netflix launch their service in over 20 countries, growing in an average of 25% a year in volume. Wow, subtitles are really taking off. So this here just kind of gives us a sense of the way in which Mr. Lefebvre, a significant figure from BTI, Media Services, describes the kind of condition in this most recent decade for localization work, which is, of course, the vast majority is, of course, subtitling work. So he refers to this sudden spurt of interest in OTT growth. Netflix customers, clients like Netflix coming to him with large amounts of content, especially backlog, so old TV series, old materials, to be translated for distribution to its global consumers. But he said things really reached ahead in with the arrival of over-the-top originals. So this is referring, of course, to the model of vertical integration, where Netflix would no longer be distributing just films for others, but actually producing its own content. And this began, of course, with House of Cards. And this is followed by what Mr. Lefebvre thinks is a contemporary collapse or impending collapse in the market. Certainly 2 of the major media giants, as localization and subtitling giants, Deluxe being one and SDI being another, have either narrowly avoided bankruptcy or have failed to make a profit in the last 2 years. Let's take a look at how Mr. Lefebvre describes these dates. So the OTT growth he sees from 2012 to 2014, the rise of the OTT originals from 2013 on to 2017, leading to this extraordinary demand for his company services, followed by a general kind of collapse that's just begun in 2018, 2019. And of course, Mr. Lefebvre hasn't commented in 2020. In fact, he left the industry, or at least left his business after some considerable disagreement with its new owners. Now, what was happening in this time? Well, we see the way in which the later arrivals to the OTT business, such as Disney, or also to some extent Amazon, when they're releasing older content, have been much more careful in securing the original subtitle rights, so that the demand for new subtitles for old material has not been strong. Now, in the middle of this, we have to describe a very kind of interesting thing which occurred in the year 2017 and 2018, which is called the HERMES project. Now, you perhaps didn't come here today for a lecture in the history of the industry, and it won't continue too much longer. We'll be moving into our next chapter soon, but please give me a little more patience. So what is the HERMES project? So the HERMES project was also itself a significant kind of interruption in the industry in 2017 and 2018. And we could say it was part of the process that instigated or began the decline that Mr. Lefebvre also mentioned. So what was the NETLFIX Hermes project? We'll take a look at two different descriptions. On the left is NETLFIX's public description. Our desire is to delight members in their language while staying true to creative intent and being mindful of cultural nuance while being creative to, while staying true to creative intent. And being mindful of cultural nuances is important to ensure quality. It's not the best sentence, but NETLFIX wrote it. It's also fueling a need to rapidly add great talent who can help provide top-notch translations for our global members. So let me describe the way in which NETLFIX to itself described the Hermes project. So Alison Smith, program manager of the localization solutions at NETLFIX, writes, stated, NETLFIX aimed to own the full process from the subtitler recruitment through to working in our tools, and this started with Hermes. So just as we see kind of vertical integration being the new model of production, whereby one studio will own both the means of production, also the means of distribution, and finally the exhibition, the place of exhibition, which will be the kind of, they don't own your television, but will provide from production all the way through to the last step of exhibition. That's vertical integration. The same model of vertical integration is being applied here also to subtitling itself. So that instead of having to work through brokers like Mr. Leffergan's company or translation and localization services, NETLFIX wished or hoped that it could actually bring that entire industry into its own creative, singular, streamlined process. Let me give you a little sense of the excitement that NETLFIX had when it first launched Hermes. Since we unveiled our new Hermes tool 2 weeks ago, thousands of candidates around the world have already completed the test, covering all represented languages. This is incredible to us because of the impact it will ultimately have on our members as we focus on continually improving the quality of the subtitles on the service. We're quickly expanding an inflection point where English won't be the primary viewing experience on NETLFIX, and Hermes allows us to better vet the individuals doing this important work so members can enjoy their favorite TV shows and movies in their language. Well, it didn't seem to work out so well. Within 12 months, NETLFIX announced we've reached our capacity for each one of the language tests due to the rapid popularity and response from applicants all over the world. Therefore, we are closing the platform to future testing at this time. It's a diplomatic way for them to admit that the Hermes project didn't work. I'm very kind of interested in what the particularities of this situation were, but a lot of it has to do with NETLFIX finding it difficult to maintain the kind of quality controls that it felt were necessary. The NETLFIX system of quality control for its media is a 5-point check. So a random 5 minutes, one from near the beginning of the production, one from a third of the way in, one from near the middle point, one from around the 2/3 point, and one from near the conclusion. These 5 points are selected to be randomly sampled and tested for accuracy. And if they meet the test, then the product is approved. This sense then of, we could call it compartmentalization and piecemealing of the work, and very much a kind of stepping back from the idea of NETLFIX being responsible for the total quality of a single film or single TV program. Rather, NETLFIX was hoping that it could rely simply on this fairly streamlined process of the 5-point check, which it still is trying to implement, but it certainly couldn't do it in-house. So this was the Hermes project, so beginning in 2017, ending quickly in 2018, seeming a lot more like Icarus falling from the sun than Hermes, but still giving us an interesting sense of some of the difficulties and some of the dreams of both subtitling and also the would-be localizers and mass media localizers for subtitling. So let's take a look at what some of these might be. So one company, Ḳ'uuna, and this is actually a significant player based in Singapore, receiving heavy investment from Japan, especially from the SoftBank investment fund. Recently made the news for its unprecedented large losses. Son Masayoshi's led SoftBank venture capital fund. So Ḳ'uuna actually bought BTI, Mr. Lefragan's company, and now has established itself in London with a global presence around the world. Let's take a look at how Ḳ'uuna understands its relation to storytelling and to the world.
We are storytellers. We encounter one another through content. We tell stories in our everyday lives. Although they may not know it, we tell stories through text, through sounds, and through voices. We tell stories around the world. We are connectors. We deliver new stories and visions in more languages, in more ways, and in more cultures than ever before. We want to reach out to people, no matter who they are or where they're from. We are now reaching out to wider audiences, and we achieve this with people from all around the world, with experts in different languages and cultures. And we're about to tell more stories together. We respect people, embrace change, and do our best to be extraordinary to enhance creativity and quality. Our goal is to communicate and share by connecting content, connecting people.
So this image here of content being connected by Ḳ'uuna, people being connected by Ḳ'uuna, is a really simple and direct explanation of how this new localization, this new mass subtitling system works. We'll take a look at, and I'll give you some details about precisely what this means for subtitling in the brave new world. So, if we take a look at it as an example, it offers traditional services, captioning, subtitles, and dubbing. And increasingly what were considered separate tasks, often handled by different companies, have over the space of the late 20th century and then accelerating in the 21st century, all become associated with the same industry services: captioning, subtitling, and dubbing. And we can add to that the recent kind of interest in quote-unquote barrier-free, the presentation of materials for people who are differently abled. For example, movies for the non-seeing, or movies for those who hear differently. Other kind of Ḳ'uuna work that is taking this as one of our examples is a cloud-based hybrid of automated and human-driven captioning service. And similarly, a cloud-based subtitling management and productivity tool. Finally, something that SoftBank Ventures, which I mentioned earlier, is very interested in, is here the voice synthesis, which is to be used for audio localization. So this is machine learning, the idea of using machine learning to translate and to localize. Now, in this model of production, we see something very different than 20th century models of subtitling. In the 20th century model of subtitling, often the subtitle would receive a package, so to speak, containing the raw materials needed for her or him to create the necessary subtitles. So a copy of the film, maybe a copy of the screenplay, maybe some specific instructions from the director and so forth. Increasingly, in this cloud-based system, all of the quote-unquote value-laden contents, and we're not talking about films anymore, we use the term contents. So the contents now are kept out of the permanent reach, you could say, of the subtitler. And in fact, what we see in new systems that were developed by, let me just move this here, new systems that were developed having a bit of trouble with my Zoom. There. New systems that were developed for this kind of burgeoning market. This is Deluxe. Well, Deluxe is one of the most important post-production companies. Now, when we say post-production, of course, this includes all kinds of things like the treatment of the film, adding color, shifting color, sound, etc. But of course, what was traditionally post-production in the most material sense of the film now includes localization services. So the industries are increasingly becoming streamlined. And just like Netflix HERMES effort, both Ḳ'uuna and here Deluxe rely on cloud-based systems. Here, Deluxe relies on a Santa Monica company founded in 2011, Santa Monica, California, that is, called Sfera. You can see the name in small letters underneath the upper left title, Deluxe Localization. So what does Sfera do? Sfera provides a platform through which subtitlers can be, we could say, evaluated against each other. So subtitlers are being monitored by keystroke. They're being monitored to see how fast they're able to produce their materials. They're being also, of course, monitored in comparison with subtitlers in other languages. So numerous teams will be subtitling the same material in several languages. And sometimes one single product, because we're talking about backlog, historical TV programs being now released for global markets, localized markets turning into global markets, we'll see this extraordinary use of wave translation, where several individuals, several subtitlers are working simultaneously on the same product, right? So the sense of, you could call it continuity from beginning to end of an individual work, a film, work of art, is increasingly parcelized at the same time as the work for the subtitler is becoming increasingly piecemeal. And of course, in some circumstances, the rates are dropping, especially since with the arrival of companies like Bitly, in fact, anyone around the world can become a subtitler. And we see the arrival, of course, quite naturally, of course, of speakers of many languages from around the world, each competing to translate those languages that they know. So this is some way in which the whole, we could call it cloud, and the cloud structure has changed some of the biggest players in the localization / subtitling industry. we might wonder, what exactly is localization? Localizing what and localizing for whom? So here, to kind of move away from this broad view of an increasingly competitive and increasingly unprofitable Fordist production of cultural content, the subtitle, let's take a look at a different kind of localization. Here I'm interested in shifting gears entirely and introducing you to a 2018 film, which is an extraordinary film made in the very west coast of Canada, in British Columbia, in the Haida-Gwaai, the Haida Islands. And we'll take a look at some discussion with one of the two co-directors of this film, which gives us a very different experience of what localization can mean. We'll just take a look at a clip and then an interview about this film.
Inha stako hagang jangi chagang wansuga dak awqisken qit yang khan daki jikit ajang hainga jinga dakat kamyan ko hagang daki jikit senga Ďaqat spánan gen, den góda ngaist íris gen, gaqaslan daid, den Ţ'uawqin nga, hu den skjan chagariw, hu den gagíchit riw.
Okay, we'll take a look now at the interview with the co-director.
Language, there are just over 20. The Haida language, there are just over 20 fluent speakers left in Haida-Gwaai. There are 3 dialects. Well, there are probably more than that, but There are 3 communities now, Sfera, Masset, and Heidelberg in Alaska. There are quite a few language champions, so people who have taken on learning the language, who've made it their life and breathe it every day and work really hard on the language. My mother's a linguist in the Tsilhqot'in language, and so this is actually what was probably one of the most intriguing aspects of the pre-production for me. I found myself really excited and kind of geeking out on, how can we prepare these actors to not only speak in that language, but emote properly, tonally. And I really wanted the few last speakers, I think because of the specific with the Haida language, with there being so few fluent speakers left, the intensity of the responsibility to get it right was really strong. I wanted the few speakers when listening to it to just be like, that's how it is, that's how it sounds.
Dank ujugang stanus keldang haldegang. Gaskilu da tatlagan gun. Gasa sifu klidang ayagan.
In one breath, it's so powerful because it is a regenerative aspect, right? With our colonial history and language being taken, finding that voice, and for that voice to be expressed again is really exciting in itself. Some of the things we did is we got audio recordings for the cast of all of their lines, and they had that about 6 months prior. So they got to study on their own. They then had mentorship, like one-on-one mentorship with either a language speaker or a champion within the community that they had a certain amount of mentorship hours with. And then we did what we called a boot camp, a language boot camp, where we spent 2 weeks living out in off-grid longhouses all together. It was also a way that we could also kind of, do the bonding before we were about to live in the bush for 6 weeks to shoot. And in that time, we played with a theater process they use for memorization and rapid memorization. And what you do is you just have someone feed lines. So you have a bunch of line feeders per scene, and you have the cast have a person each who feeds them lines, and they stand up like as though they're on a stage, and they just do the scene over and over and over and over again with someone just orally feeding them the lines. Not only do they get that memorization process with them there, but they also will then be able to be coached by these language speakers who'll say, no, you don't go up there in tone when you're asking a question, like that's English, Haida, we don't do that. It was such hard work. And I remember finally, after giving them a week to do that, it was like, okay, let's all come together, let's pick one scene, and selected a bunch of the actors. And I said, okay, this time we're going to do it. I just want you guys to act like giddy teenagers. Do the whole scene that way. Like giddy, giddy, giddy. You just, person you have a crush on has just arrived and they've brought you, a gift and da-da-da-da. And so it was incredible because as they began, people were feeding them their lines and they were now bringing the emotion to the lines. So then it was super alive, right? And then all of a sudden the actors were just saying their lines without being fed, and they shocked themselves. Like within that week they had memorized. It was a pretty powerful couple weeks.
So here we saw an interview with Helen Haig-Brown. She is actually a First Nations Canadian who comes from the prairies, so from very flat area, and she was solicited. She had already moved to the West Coast and was then solicited into this project with Gwaai Edenshaw, who was a local Haida artist. Now, you may have heard of the Haida because, in fact, Haida art sells very, very well. There's an incredible high-end, high art market for Haida work. But of course, the success of Haida art is not in any way paralleled by the survival of its language. The Haida population was, of course, decimated by smallpox, reducing the population by 95%, so that only 350 Haida remained in 1900. And then the 20th century for First Nations people in Canada has seen the forced dislocation of children into residential schools where they were taught only in English, the passing of language bans, and also of cultural practice bans by the Canadian government. Well, these have been rescinded in the recent decades, and apologies have been given from the Canadian government. Still, similar histories are unfolding in the United States, and even in the case of Canada and the Haida themselves, it's in many ways too late. It is unlikely that because the majority of speakers of Haida, of the 20 speakers, are themselves over 75, it's unlikely that there will be any first language speakers of Haida remaining. And this film is an incredible project of localization. It takes the logic of localization and in some ways shifts it upside down. Here we see localization of the entire method of film production so that film can serve as both a project of recording and also a regenerative project of language revitalization. This kind of strategy, for me, speaks to the ways in which subtitling, though it's facing a very tough time in these mass-marketed and highly streamed cloud-based services, it's often the connection to very local and very small projects where we see a real kind of flourishing of subtitling happening today, and a real kind of, I think, enthusiasm for what the power of the text on screen can do. So one scholar who we might turn to very briefly in thinking about this is the scholar Marcus Nornis, who's presented at in Frankfurt before, and I believe on this topic. But he locates what he calls abusive subtitles. He locates the strength of a translation in its abuse. And by abuse here, he doesn't necessarily mean to damage or to destroy, but in some ways to destabilize what is thought to be a natural and hidden relation of the force of language in connecting through media. So Nornis writes, where an original text strains language through textual knots dense with signification, the translation, and I think we could here think about the streamlined cloud forms of translation, perform an analogous violence against the target. Corrupt subtitlers can disavow the violence of the subtitle, while abusive translators will actually revel in it. Put more concretely, the abusive subtitler uses textual and graphic abuse, that is, experimentation with language and its grammatical, morphological, and visual qualities to bring the fact of translation from its position of obscurity to critique the imperial politics that ground corrupt practices, while ultimately leading the viewer to the foreign original being reproduced in the darkness of the theater. Well, here, of course, the foreign original is in fact English, which is only reproduced in the subtitles. The original is not an origin threatened by contamination, but a locus of the individual and the international, which can potentially turn the film into an experience of translation. Let's move on and consider in closing one final artist. This is the artist Sky Hopinka, who I think you'll find very interesting and inspiring. Sky Hopinka is a Native American filmmaker whose work has recently drawn significant attention in the experimental and independent film world in the United States. He recently completed and screened through video streaming because of the pandemic his first feature-length film, which was funded through the Sundance Indigenous Film Fund. Of course, Sky Hopinka is an artist whose work I quickly grew to love when I first encountered him. This film, Venite et Loquamur, is one of the few films that's made in Latin. Come Together and Let Us Speak is the story of a Latin club that meets several weeks during the summer here just to practice Latin. I think it's very unusual, of course, that such a, we could say, dull group of people, and I don't think they're dull, but the stereotype of them as being dull, that Hopinka could make a film out of Latin speakers doing what they do best, which is speaking Latin. This film, of course, was followed by other films that started to use the graphic subtitle in ways that suggested images and motifs from Hopinka's own history. Hopinka is part Chippewa, but also moved to the West Coast and started to learn Wawa, which is a trade language. Excuse me, part Chinuk. Wawa is a trade language. Wawa, of course, is the name of a film we'll take a look at shortly. But Hopinka has a specific relation to Japan. He's very much inspired by the Japanese architect Kengo Kuma. And I wanted to take a look at this quotation that Sky Hopinka uses at the beginning of a 2017 film, Anti-Objects, or Space Without Path or Boundary. So Hopinka borrows from Kengo Kuma. The individual is not an autonomous, solitary object, but a thing of uncertain extent with ambiguous boundaries. So too is matter, which loses most of its allure the moment it is reduced to an object, shorn of its viscosity, pressure, and density. Both subject and matter resist their reduction into objects. Everything is interconnected and intertwined. So this next film, which is in fact my favorite of Hopinka's films, is one where you can already see from this still where the subtitle takes on an empowering but also overwhelming presence in the image. So Wawa is a trade language, language used by a variety of Native American peoples and also by some non-Native Americans as well. Hopinka moved to the West Coast where he started to study under a very famous linguist who was recording and working on kind of preserving the Wawa, this Wawa language. Now, very interestingly for us, this figure, Howard Zenk, who is so involved in preserving the language, is an Anglo-white person. And he's trying to learn this language, of course, knowing that he will never be able to speak it in the way in which it was spoken by its first and earliest speakers. Or so he thinks. But in fact, the older Native American from whom he is learning the language says, no, you shall speak as fluent, you will be fluent speaking just as you speak. We'll take a look at a clip from Wawa that'll give you a sense of the way in which Hopinka is trying to make complex this question of authenticity and language, and of course, the force of the subtitle. Now, particularly important here is the way in which the language of Native Americans, like First Nations people in Canada, was thought to be, quote unquote, the language of the savage. So to speak a native tongue meant to speak a savage tongue. And very much, I think, Hopinka's work is a part of a process of rectifying and shifting this process of a community's relation and a nation's relation to language. We'll take a look at Hopinka's film now, Wawa.
Johnny? Johnny. Piaga Sutran.
Ugug Johnny Yaga Sladwatil Portland, Wigna?
No, Witka.
Ik de Yaga Munkaba. Ik de Johnny Yaga Munkaba.
Ja, ik check it van de EP en zeg Wawa. He worked inside some coffee house. Kaba.
Tlaxa Chaga.
Johnny P. Uptitchman.
We naga conducts na Witka, Haida, Chagu, Chinuk Wawa. Well, naga mugnim Chinuk Wawa uk sitkim Chinuk Kagwa Shawa Stilchum Ankadi Fuska Munkuguk. Naga mugnim Chinuk jargon uk Wawa Kagwa Boston Tilchum Fuska Munkuguk. Bus Fuska Munk Lalong Uguk. Dennis Ḳ'uuna.
Then they'd have to admit I can't speak well. I can't speak Chinuk Wawa well. I say it all. I'm fooling you. You don't know anything. You just blab on.
Gwaai
Edenshaw, she never get up, naga clean out the topi, iskam coffee, tea, knowledge, Luke.
Dennis Ḳ'uuna Boston Tilchum Pus Wawa be Chi naga iskam Lamarkaba Ugu Echt Ulman Wilson Bob naga Wawa Yaga Hada Maiga Dret Kagpus Dret Tach Labush Yaga.
There's not a little bit you know, not even a little bit do you know. That's not even a little bit you don't know. You don't even know a little bit. You don't know very much anyhow. A miserable excuse for an Indian you are. You can't speak Chinuk Wawa well. Later, you'll be good. With ITU talking a lot, later on you truly will speak it really well.
We Dreadflush, but
Plus with country yaga, conducts Boston on yaga, Mook, Plush Wawa Kagwa, Hada, Conway Boston Tilchum yaga, conducts it, Fuska Kada. But, so Ayak yaga, Tach Labush, Tlaxa Ugu Balan, Weak yaga, Dret Plush Musa, plus Dret Ul yaga. Dret
Pi Damala, ik de Magamunk.
By just blabbering, you'll disappoint me. But say all that you're saying, fine. You go say it, just talking every which way. You want to talk anyway, but you know if you don't know how to say it, later on you will learn how. Oh, I don't speak well now, but I will speak Chinuk Wawa really well.
Taksa uur manchia, weekjager dret vloes musen, pas dret oerjager. Pitfalsjager dalesjager. Kijk, het dan alwakti, tundum alwakti shawars, mani. We country.
Yalden, Uguk Bulikli Maiga, Plaza Kilpai Kaba, Chicago, Chicago Ikdamamuk.
Just you and me. But with the two of us just going on talking away, later on you will learn. You should say everything that you want to say, even if it's completely wrong. Say it. That's the way you will learn it. You certainly will know it really well. You'll speak it so very straight, you won't be at all white. You'll be Indian. You know when they say shawash, a lot of times the old timers, you don't know nothing. You're a real Indian. You are so ignorant. You know they say that. Used to say it.
Okay, we'll stop here. I wanted to give you, excuse me, I wanted to share this work by Hopinka with you because I think it raises some of the issues around translation, around fidelity, and around, of course, the abusive subtitle, the abusive translation that Nornis has raised. But for me, it raises even more significantly the question of what exactly localization is. Can we think of transposing the idea of localization as that thing which is small, which goes to the big, the making of the local for the world, or its inverse, the making of the international local? Can we think of localization not necessarily in terms of these two-way streets between something that is specific and something that is grand, between something that can be turned into capital and the motion or the movement of capital? But could we instead think of localization indeed as this process, an uncertain process capable of capturing nuance, of capturing subtlety, of capturing uncertainty as well. And of course, a very powerful project in the sustaining of the human spirit. Of course, we might imagine that the human spirit is strong, but it's also filled entirely with these moments of uncertainty, of not being confident in oneself, in one's identity, and even in one's language. And here this use of subtitles that literally spreads across the screen the various kinds of ways of interpreting, the multiple interpretations possible, I think is a very interesting project for us to think about. We think about this relationship of the local to the international and to the market. Now, of course, when it comes to text on screen, we can think of many examples in the East Asian context, particularly Danmaku, right? The kind of curtain-like barrage of texts made by a user, a viewer of a particular content. Now, this was promoted first by Nico Nico Doga, a Japanese small video kind of online upload site. This idea of kind of peppering the image with words, multiple words, using words to create a kind of visual image, using the subtitle for its aesthetic purposes as well. So we can see the way in which, whether it's in the case of cultural and language revitalization, in the case of Native American communities and First Nation communities, or whether it's the highly, you could say, individual relation to a community of anonymous viewers in the case of danmaku, or kind of arrow streaming, arrow curtain, individualized commentary on a video, we can see many ways in which the subtitle is actually sometimes as big as the screen. So we already come to 10 after, so I'd like to kind of close my lecture on that point. And if there are any questions, I'd certainly be very happy to do my best in answering them. Thank you very much for your time today. I hope the material was of some interest to you. All right. Well, I'll just, in closing, maybe give you a couple more images. This image here, of course, of here, Henry. Henry is the Anglo white man who's complaining to Bob Wilson, the older Native American man who's the speaker, the last speaker of Wawa, who had learned it as a youth, teaching his language to Henry. Henry feeling, of course, that he's being mocked, but in fact being encouraged in this process. The very last image here of, for my presentation is Sky Hopinka's Dislocation Blues. So this was a film that actually took the politics of gender and the politics of sexuality and looked at questions of language, at questions of resistance against capital, especially transnational energy capital, and questions of what it means to be two-spirit or transgendered in the context of this broader movement. And Hopinka was very successful in kind of weaving what seemed to be very, very disparate questions. So Hopinka's most recent film, which was just released a few months ago, maڵni, or To the Sea, is the first feature-length film that's been made in Chinuk Wawa. So if you have an opportunity to see that, I would encourage you. The film is shot with significantly two characters, one who speaks to the camera in English, whose language is then subtitled into Chinuk Wawa, and the other is a Chinuk Wawa speaker. In fact, someone who was learning along with Sky Hopinka, who speaks only Chinuk Wawa in the film, and his words are translated at the bottom of the screen into English. So we have one question. Can it still be considered a subtitle when it's such a big part of the experience? That's a really great observation. The whole idea of the sub makes us think, of course, of at the bottom, there are surtitles, and you go to the opera in some countries, they'll have titles above the screen. But the sub is also suggestive of subordinate, submissive. And I think we're speaking here of a politics where maybe the question of the text being subordinate, the text being in the service of telling the story, is called into question. We see the ways in which the text and the visuality of the language is part of the very story itself. Kind of goes back to our Ďuno experience, but I don't think that's precisely what they were thinking about when they said we are all storytellers. Thank you for the question. Well, I hope you will come to the JVTA, try the JVTA subtitling workshop, which will be held tomorrow. It's a really great place and great way to get your hands into subtitling. You might think that I'm presenting a discouraging picture of subtitling. Not at all. I think the idea of subtitling where you're working distant and far from the text is not so, is increasingly a world in decline. And we're seeing a kind of return of the importance of the engagement with the cultural material and an increase, we could say, grassroots attention and sensitivity to the importance of the subtitle. So one question, what's the film title with the 2 languages? So the film title with the 2 languages, oh yes, so that is maڵni, M-A-L-N-I. I think it's toward the ocean or toward the sea. I'm just typing this. I may have the title wrong. I believe that's the title, maڵni toward the sea, or maybe maڵni toward the ocean. But it's an idea here, of course, of making a Chinuk Wawa film for speakers of Chinuk Wawa. Also another question, do you think it is more important to translate directly and keep things that people from other cultures might not understand, or to localize the subtitles? Well, that's a fascinating question. I think this is, of course, all within the, one has to understand what is the strategy or the impulse of the film and of the filmmaker. One of the problems I have with Nornis's original kind of conception of abusive subtitles is that they frequently triumphed the image as a space of purity over the written text, which was somehow associated with a false fidelity or a fake faithfulness. I think in many cases we actually see the ways in which even quote unquote invisible translations that are not noticeable, not abusive, that don't stand out, are negotiating very, very complex questions of trying to communicate. I think it depends upon the market as well. If we're thinking, if something's going to be consumed in 3 or 4 minutes, maybe there's not the time or the space possible to do the kind of cultural transmission that we would like. But I guess I would say that it's always okay to have something that's not understandable. I think the idea of perfect transmission is deeply problematic, and I think we see this in the Chinuk Wawa film, the idea that, of course you're not going to have a complete seamless transmission of language. It's always going to be filled with errors. So that is an important thing. At the same time as trying to capture the intention of the film. Maybe the intention of the film is not the story. The intention of the film might be the language itself. The First Nation Canadian film, presumably it was written in English. This is a question. So the spoken language is really the translation. So the first film, the Haida-Gwaai film, so that was the story of the film is a kind of timeless story from the Haida-Gwaai culture. So it's a story that had already been told in Haida-Gwaai. There are actually 3 different communities. One is in southern Alaska and 2 are in Canada, and they used one particular region there. But the story is not you could say, originally an English story. It is a story that comes from that culture and that language. There must have been certain processes of translation, of course, that go that allow the story to be negotiated and thought through English. But it was the elders of the community who repeated the tale and then also supervised the production of the screenplay. The spoken language is really the translation. I think we could say that very much, yes. Well, maybe it's come to the end of our time. I think we're close. If there are any further questions, I'm happy to entertain them, but and do my best with them. But we'll see. The last comment about the spoken language is the translation. It's really interesting to think about. Like in some ways, you could think the spoken language is quote unquote merely the translation from English, but the spoken language, in fact, is what is the subject of the film, and it is what was brought from the local community. So English in some ways is a stopping point, a resting point. Yeah. One more question. Subtitling seems to me the easiest way to make a movie accessible outside the origin country. You talked about a collapse in 2018 after the overwhelming amount of movies Netflix produces. How expensive is subtitling of a movie roundabout? Well, this really, really depends on the market. I think if we're thinking, maybe we turn to the Japanese case. I think we can find films that are subtitled for around $1,000 or $2,000 for a feature film. So we're not talking about a very large amount of money. And in fact, when we're looking at cloud services and cloud streaming, we might find even less. Of course, it's the translators who are able to work the fastest who can make the most. I think it might be interesting to take a look at the ways in which certain kinds of services are offered. And let me just here bring you back to the Ķ'uuna site. I'm going to share my screen again. So taking a look at what Ķ'uuna is interested. This is the same web page we looked at earlier. We took a look at a video. We'll take a look at how the Ķ'uuna Media Group is recruiting freelancers. Oops. Here. Oh, well, I had some problem logging in, I guess. I was able to do this earlier today. Oh, maybe I try here. Oh, yes, here, this is it. So here you can see they offer transcription, translation, proofreading, quality control, and script dubbing. Let's take a look here, for example, translation. So this means the subtitling. Here, to look at their job bulletin, you could type in, maybe you're interested in going from, just to see how it works. How about from Thai to Japanese? Maybe we try the other way around. Let's just include Japanese, see what it brings up. Well, actually, it doesn't offer anything right now. I was doing a search recently though, and I could see about 5 or 6 jobs, but they don't list the price. And usually there's a very, very small, cent amount per letter. That's the way calculations are done by many places now. Of course, companies like JVTA or other more kind of small, we could say boutique subtitling companies have very different models, and they work very differently. Just today, I was just talking about the kind of conglomerate streaming service, streaming model of subtitles. Okay, another question. When looking at Japanese translations of English media, I noticed the lack of the subtext in many subtitles, robbing the joy, joke, and spontaneity. is there a recommendation of how to combine reading speed and facet? I'm not sure what facet means. Fact, maybe, or context. You know, one of the things I think is that I always recommend not trying to translate everything, because if you try to translate everything, there's not enough time to read it all, and you'll have to make terrible sacrifices at the level of nuance and style. It's better to actually choose a smaller amount to subtitle in terms of information content, and then for that information content, add in the tone, the style, the jokes, the humor, so that you can get the tone exactly right. I think in this sense, rather than have a voluminous amount, large amount of poorly translated material, it's better to have a narrower range of information that is translated with more nuance, humor, joke, etc. Subtitling is a very, very interesting world, and I wouldn't discourage anyone from getting involved and trying to learn how. There are more and more ways where you can do it by yourself, but it also makes sense to study how to do it. Just a little bit of study will make you much more capable and much faster at doing it, and I think have more confidence and ultimately more joy in the experience. Well, I thank you very much for your participation today, coming, and I wish we were all in person somewhere. I wish you well, stay well in the era of the pandemic, and hopefully 2021 will bring us back all to Frankfurt again. But how great to have this festival online as well. It'd be nice if part of it could be preserved that way too. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.